So the presentation today, we're from England. We were going to try and do it in Latvian, but we think we'll just stick with English for now. So today we're talking about the real power of genetics. So just a quick question for everyone in the audience. Who here has heard of DNA testing before? If you can put up your hands.
Great.
Amazing. And who here has done a DNA test? If you can put up your hands.
No one. Oh, one.
Two.
Two.
Amazing. So we have lots of DNA kits for sale. That's great news. So when you've heard about genetics and DNA, there's a lot of ways that this can influence your life. And today what we're looking at doing is saying, what is that potential? What can DNA testing actually do?
So I'm Hannah Morden-Nicholson, and I work alongside David. And our company is called Living DNA, which is basically a direct-to-consumer company that lets you buy DNA kits and makes the information as accessible and understandable as possible.
So when we started the business, what we found in the industry was DNA testing is something that can deliver fantastic value to people, but it's really, really complicated. And what we wanted to do is make that simple. So neither of us went to university, have degrees in genetics or science, but what we could see is a huge potential to deliver this science in a simple way. So in 2001, we initially set up a company that allowed you to store your DNA. Now, we thought this was a fantastic idea because you could take a sample using a mouth swab, you could put this in a tin, you could store it. And we had maybe 50, 60,000 people around the world buy this. And then everyone realized, my DNA is with me anyway. Why would I put it in a tin and store it? And so what we then came on to do is to actually see what was possible with DNA testing next. In 2003, we saw the first whole genome was ever sequenced. And this cost something like $3 billion to sequence a human genome. In 2004, we got involved with DNA paternity testing. So this is telling you who's the father of the child, how you're related to someone else. And this was something that at the time, in 2004, everyone was worried about the police accessing your DNA. The whole concept of DNA is something in the UK and the US that really wasn't heard of back then. And in 2006, we started to realize there was a potential in tracing your ancestry, tracing where you came from in the world, using DNA testing. But all the companies that were doing this were celebrating the fact that we're all unique and different. But none of them were actually bringing us together to show no matter what our DNA is, we're actually all connected. So we've got a little video here that's going to just give you an insight into why we started Living DNA, and the fact that in 2006 we were contacted by a charity in the UK to discuss could DNA testing be used to combat racism. So if you picture schools in North England, it's not as much sun as it was here today, kind of bleak. Fish and chips are there, so that's a good bonus. But we had kids at the age of 6, 7, and 8 walking into schools, turning around and saying things like, if you're not white, you should be shot. If you're not from the UK, get back to your country. So this was the sort of stuff that was going on, and the governments were trying to say, how do we combat racism before it becomes a real issue? So we were the first program to introduce a DNA testing program with schools. And here's a video on it, if that plays. Not sure how to press play for this.
Here we go. Does it have sound?
It's got some sound.
Thank you to Living DNA.
Living DNA!
So the reason that we're in the whole ancestry business is because of things like that, where we can actually go into schools and we can give kids DNA samples, and from that, they can actually see that they come from so many different places in the world. And I went to this school in France, in a tiny little village, and there was this little kid, he was about 6 years old, And he got his DNA done, and I was showing him his results, and he had DNA from everywhere, places across China, places across Europe. He had parts of DNA from Africa. It was a complete mix. And he sat there with this DNA, and his mum was there, and he said, "Isn't this cool? Because I can go home now and tell Dad that all those people that he teases, I'm from there." So this little kid was empowered to know that his DNA showed him something different. And we have to remember that DNA testing isn't about celebrating how unique your ancestry is today. It's also about reminding us that we're all so similar. At the moment, with where society is at, I think that's kind of important.
So in 2015, we set up Living DNA. In 2016, the cost of the whole genome went down to roughly $1,000 or below, and DNA kits like the ones that we sell at Living DNA started to go on sale for $99. And what you started to see here is by 2018, about 30 million people across the world have actually taken DNA tests. And the issue that's now coming up is, what about the privacy and security of that data? What's actually going to happen to my genetic information? So one of the big things we've been doing is working with people to understand they're empowered with their own DNA. That DNA they're in control of when you test with a company like Living DNA. So 2019, privacy and security. 2020, this is an example of what people get with their DNA results. It's all about, how do I actually turn this information into something that can transform my life and improve the quality of my life?
So a lot of the bigger companies who do DNA testing, they focus a lot on ancestry. And the reason is because a lot of us are looking for connections, we're looking for relatives, we're looking for who we're related to, and also where our history and heritage is at. So the potential is, how do you deliver that in a really simple, informative way that can show you, great, this is your ancestry breakdown, this is who you share DNA with. But that is kind of just the start of what's possible with DNA and what it can actually show you.
So what we're seeing now is we're talking about, what about the next billion people? So everyone in the audience that didn't put up their hands, that could afford DNA testing, because it's now roughly 49 euros for a DNA kit, so it's not an expensive thing to do, that you could benefit from this DNA testing, but mostly you're saying, well, what does this actually mean for me? What am I going to get from DNA testing? So what we're seeing is this growing blueprint. We're seeing a blueprint not only of 30 million people, but a potential to deliver a blueprint of over 1 billion people. And when we have 1 billion people tested, there's two ways that we could go with this. And this is a question that all of us, and within your country and within every country we're going to have to ask is, are we going to use DNA testing to try and improve and perfect the human body? Or are we going to use DNA testing not to lead in that, but to provide the definitive, to provide what is actually going on in society, and from there allow us to know how to respond and change our lifestyles? In the past, you've seen that we've got rid of polio, but now cancer is kind of ripping through society. And if it's not cancer, it's diabetes. Then if it's not diabetes, it's obesity. Basically, nothing is actually stopping and saying, what is the state of health in society? Now, over here in Latvia, you have a pretty great high score on society, on health, on well-being. That's not the norm across the world. So if we were talking in America, you would have probably 4 out of 5 of the audience would be obese. Like, very different statistics at what's going on here. So I think what DNA testing can potentially do is it can actually tell us not only what we already know, but it can bring to the forefront the fact that with a definitive, with an actual statistics across the world of where society is at, we can then perhaps stop and decide how to respond and how to change our life going forward for this generation and for the next generation. Because the reality of society at the moment is racism is an all-time high. No matter where you are in the world, from human trafficking to slavery, we talk about in the US the great abolition of slavery for the black community, but there is more slavery, sex trafficking, financial trafficking that's happening from Asia across to Europe than was ever the case with the African American populations.
we're building walls in the US. Brexit's about to happen.
We don't know if that's going to happen.
Well, that's true. That's true. But it's like the state that we're in at the moment is us and them. And DNA shows otherwise. It shows that we're all actually very, very similar.
Because every single person in the audience here today, within the last few thousand years, we are all part of one family. We're all actually connected and related to each other.
We would all share a common ancestor, which is pretty cool.
So the other thing we've got to consider is 80% of illness and disease is actually lifestyle related. So this means that we've got incredible medical care systems, incredible drugs, pharmaceuticals that do an amazing job. But actually, the real truth of our vitality, the real truth of our health is actually in our own hands.
It doesn't make sense that today we have more doctors, more procedures, more surgery, more medication than ever before, and yet people are still getting sicker. And in addition to that, we've got doctors who are supposed to be intelligent and at the forefront committing suicide. So there's something wrong. There's something going on that we're not willing to totally see.
So if we look in Africa, so you've seen the wonderful movies online, the documentaries, and you see the incredible cheetahs and lions across the plains. Do we ever see like an overweight lion? Like, what if we did? What if we suddenly saw an overweight lion? We would probably go, there is something wrong there. But we don't do that and question ourselves because we're apparently more intelligent. The other thing to consider is the last 20 years of our lives are actually spent medicated. So the amount of drugs that everyone's on in that last 20 years is really, really high. So when we look at that, we're saying we've got all this incredible technology, but we're actually living a very low standard of life, a very low quality of life at the moment. But it's not all doom and gloom. This is not meant to be a depressive talk about what's going on in the world. This is about how can we actually use DNA to be empowered. And I think ultimately it's going to be, what if we can change that? There isn't going to be a government that's going to change this. There's not going to be one company or one group, but it's going to come down to each of us saying, what if I could use that information, use what my DNA tells me to actually change the course of my future history? And with that, what we've really got to see is the great power that comes, but the great responsibility that is needed.
The thing about DNA is that it's you. It's your genetic, personal data, your information. And that is rarely valuable to people. It's extremely valuable. We'll cover it a little bit more later. So we also have to consider, what are we doing with this data? How are we looking at it? How are we interpreting it? Because it can either be used to benefit or it can be used to poison. If you look at an example like the internet, it was set up so that people could do business, so that people could chat to relatives across the world, so that we could order things super quickly and get them next day thanks to Amazon. There's so many amazing things about the internet, and yet, because of the internet, we have cyber abuse, we have trolling, we have more kids getting affected than ever before because it's so easy to hide behind a computer screen and tell somebody something that we think that they are. So with great power comes that responsibility of how are we going to use this genetic information? Because the thing is, things haven't slowed down. We're always looking for the biggest bridge to build, for the tallest building, for the fastest car, for the electric car. Genetics is no different. It has amazing potential. But if we use it in the wrong way, we will actually shoot ourselves in the foot.
So this example, just on cyber abuse, 72% of people surveyed across the world of all ages have experienced cyber abuse. So it's just something that we have to kind of consider there when we look at DNA. But with DNA and the billions of areas of DNA, what we have the ability to do is to actually show you new things. With DNA, you get to find out who you're related to. Not only just paternity tests, but cousins across the world. There are thousands and hundreds of thousands of people that are finding new family members dotted across the world thanks to consumer DNA testing.
You can find out about your ancestry. So you can find out where in the world your ancestry is from, and that can help you with research or start to figure out which paths you take to find relatives, and it just gives you a little bit more insight into who you are. Knowing your ancestry is also really valuable when it comes to anything like health traits or anything like that, because you can start to identify where things can come from.
So for instance, I'm 25% Italian, and I was really excited about that, being from the UK. That was a big kudos, so now everywhere I go, I can say I'm Italian. When it came to exercise, though, my exercise scores were not as good as Hannah's over here, so I have to do a bit more stretching than the average person.
Exercise and DNA is really fascinating because there's a lot of, let's say, fitness apps that is a huge growing market. And yes, there's a lot of successful apps as well. But what if you could look at your DNA and understand how your body best responds? So for instance, how flexible are you? What's your muscle strength like? Are you better at anaerobic exercise or aerobic exercise? Are you better at endurance or not so much? Should you do swimming and walking, or should you do more weightlifting in the gym? What's the best kind of exercise that could benefit your body? So DNA is really, really insightful. So long as we use it to support our bodies, i.e. we listen to what our bodies can deal with, we don't use it as the be-all and end-all.
We can do the same with nutrition, understanding what foods or medicine we could actually take.
Again, there's nothing like what your body can tell you, but wouldn't it be amazing if through DNA you were able to look at things like your calcium levels or your vitamin D levels, and you can take that into your own hands and look at something where you can make changes in your life to alter these.
You can look at skincare. What type of skincare products would suit you best? And these are all, because we're at an innovation festival, these are all business opportunities and ideas that over here in Latvia would be possible to come up with skincare that's actually tailored and based on genetics as well as lifestyle. And ultimately, you can look at health, looking at what type of conditions are you most susceptible to, so you could actually do something about it before you get the condition. But a really interesting thing that we always like to look at is medication. And some of the stats show that about 3 out of 5 Americans take medication, but up to 70% of the drugs that we take across the world have absolutely no effect on us.
So for instance, through my DNA, I've learned that warfarin has no effect on me, which is a really common drug. But if I was to be given it, it wouldn't do anything. And the thing about the pharmaceutical companies at the moment is they don't really care. They produce drugs, they sell them on, we take the drugs, they do or don't work, it's much of a muchness. But what if through your DNA you could get a report that showed you how you respond to different medications, and you could take that to your doctor to say, you know what, these drugs, they actually work, so let's start with this. The other thing is there are a lot of people die every year from a medication that they're allergic to or react to. If you took this test, you could possibly alleviate that. This could save lives by knowing what medication is suited to your body.
With over 4 billion drugs subscribed annually across the US, that's a huge impact that it could actually have on us. And what we're seeing there is about 52% of rehospitalizations can be reduced by actually making sure everyone has those correct drugs in the first place. And we're seeing that from a simple test of antidepressant testing, when you do a DNA test for antidepressants, you can save roughly $5,500 a year on the wrong prescription cost. Now, for a healthcare systems where you have to pay, that's a huge impact, a huge benefit.
But it's also the healthcare systems where you don't have to pay. So in the UK, we have the NHS, but as you all know, it's crippling because everyone's using it, and it's not necessarily being used for all the right reasons.
But that's only one part of the story. So far we've said, with DNA and genetics, we can understand that there's changes that we can all make in our life to improve the quality of our lives. There's huge amounts of industries that can grow from making sure that this stuff is personalized to you. But then we bring in epigenetics, and epigenetics is basically where you have your base DNA code, and then you have the way that you live. And think of it kind of like light switches. Based on how you live, you can turn on and off the likelihood of getting different conditions. And one of the studies that was done was in Detroit. And in Detroit, this was during the period of the Great Recession to do with cars and GM Motors and Ford and all the factories closing down. They actually did a study, and the entire city's epigenetic code changed based on the fact that people were depressed. They've done other studies where you've had a room of people and you've measured the epigenetics of those people. Someone's walked in angry, and the DNA has changed. What if in the future the responsibility that we will be held to is if you walk into a room angry, someone in the future could sue you because you might get sick because your DNA changed because of them? Really, really interesting things to consider. So ultimately, though, there's this responsibility of the great unknown that we like to call it. And what if there is this opportunity to have a definition through DNA and not perfection? And one of the biggest topics that comes up, and it's been a topic that's been around for many years, is that of designer babies. So for the last 20 years or so, you can pick the eye color, the gender, the hair color of your baby, and actually choose to have this sort of perfect child.
And what if that was possible? What if you could have somebody who was born super beautiful and they were like absolutely talented ahead of their time? Let's say they were amazing and incredible in music. So they started writing and producing songs that were just ahead of the game. They started dancing like no one had ever seen before. And you have this person who's like an elitist in their field and a leader in their field. And they get all the recognition and all the fame. Be cool, right? But what if it's already happened? What if we've already had Michael Jackson? And how do we actually consider what's happened to him and the way that his life ended on medication? We have to really consider what we're doing when we start to look at altering and modifying genes, because we have no idea what the effects are. We don't know yet what happens when we start to pick different traits that we want a person to be. And the reason for that is that as humans, we're emotional. We have an emotional intelligence that you can't alter the DNA of, that is dependent on how you're brought up, how you respond and react to situations. Gene editing completely overrides that.
So there's huge potential, but it's the only potential in saying, instead of saying, let's go and engineer designer babies so that they become this perfect picture, what if we said, let's look at the reality of society, and then when we start to play with what's happening for the best for the next generation, we can consider all the other forces that are at play. We can understand what we're doing, what those impacts will have, but we can also understand that no matter how much we change the genes, is that fundamentally going to change the rates of well-being and vitality across society? So I think one of the questions that we really have is will we embrace genetics and epigenetics in its ability to transform society from fixing illness at the end to actually saying true preventative care? If you did a DNA test, and that DNA test helped you understand the types of foods to cut out, even if they were your favorite food, if it said, look, dairy isn't really good for you, but you really love that chocolate cake, would that actually matter? Would you do something about it? These are the questions that we need to ask ourselves. Will we embrace DNA for that sort of aspect? And really what we're saying as a company from Living DNA's perspective is we feel that is our responsibility, not to tell anyone what to do, but to offer out what that opportunity is. So what if we actually use those DNA results to provide that base? Use the DNA results to provide the definitive rather than trying to manipulate DNA to forge what those results will be. That's something that we could do that would actually mean that DNA and genetics transforms all our lives for the future.
DNA can't be the leader. If we make it the leader, then it won't work, because before DNA, we're people first. We have to be considerate of our lifestyles and how we live first, and let the DNA support us with the information it can provide.
So what we've seen is that people who've taken DNA tests in a way where you can actually understand that you are part of that picture, where DNA contributes to the story, have more enriched family lives. We've seen the fact that most people at the dinner table still are on cell phones. Most families don't sit round the table anymore and share memories. And we've seen that actually a simple DNA test where you actually get a printed book of your results brings families together to start to talk about the past in a way they've never spoken about before.
We've seen that people who know more about their bodies start to put into place some of these lifestyle changes. People who just take a moment to listen to what their bodies are saying can work with the DNA to try different things. So for instance, I got a report back that said that I couldn't have lactose. I was lactose intolerant. So I tried it. I took out lactose and I feel amazing. But it's working with the information to say, well, what's important to me? Like, what do I really value? Do I really value the cheese and the cake? Or do I really value how I feel every morning? And is that more important? And when that becomes more important, there's so much that DNA can offer.
And the one that I really love recently has been, I've always thought I was really bad at exercise. I could never go to the gym. I'd always feel like, well, actually that's a lie. I could easily go to the gym. I chose not to. But with the DNA test, what I realized is I needed to wind down a bit more before the gym and a bit more after, so I could actually regulate my training regime in a way that would support me, and therefore I'd actually enjoy that process. And then what we start to see is ultimately our healthcare risks. What if you were given a test that would tell you the percentage of likelihood of getting diabetes, or your percentage of likelihood of getting a certain form of cancer, but at the same time, you also had the answers of what to do with that information?
The barrier with DNA testing is that they give you information, but then they don't tell you how to use it. And most people don't really listen to the information. They just want to know what to do with it. So if we as companies can deliver it in a way where it makes sense, where it's super clear, where you get the support you need to incorporate it into your lifestyles, then actually there is a purpose in this kind of test, because you can start to incorporate it into your day-to-day.
And genetics is very new. So even over here, where there is fantastic healthcare, as I understand, some of the doctors don't understand the impacts of DNA and genetics. So what if there was a way that someone could set up a business whereby people could actually take a test and then use telemedicine to actually understand the type of conditions that you could have, to get the support from a genetic counselor, so that when you actually get your results, you feel supported in the process. Ultimately, what we're seeing here is that what if discovering who you truly are actually does lead to a greater quality of life? What if having that information, that understanding together, means that actually we don't need to do that in the pursuit of perfection? That we can understand and appreciate that actually our lives, no matter how we may look, or the color of our hair, or the color of our skin, doesn't actually make us feel joyful every day. That doesn't make us feel the most incredible people, but that's something that we can nurture and we can focus on. What if DNA and genetics can be used to contribute to our well-being, to our life? And it doesn't have to be used simply just to provide us with the ideal at the end. And what if that means that we're actually all in charge of our own future, our own healthcare?
There's so many opportunities for us as a society to improve where we are, to change our lives so that we're not as anxious, we're not as stressed, we're not as unhappy. We don't rely on substances to keep us going. It's everywhere. But the question is, how do we actually make it really simple and really accessible? And so what we're saying is, it starts with us. The buck stops with us. And if these tools can help us understand it and empower us to do so, then as a company, we've done our jobs.
Yeah. And what if the ultimate businesses in the future are going to be the businesses that help us stay in touch with our bodies in a way that don't give us the answers, but help us actually connect to the answers that are already there, the stories that are already told, and the next steps that we can all take? What if that is the future, and that is the future of what genetics can truly offer? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you for coming here and sharing with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.